So you've discovered woodworking and you want to try your hand at this classic project, but you don't know what's possible with the tools that you have. I mean, what does it actually take to make a beginner level cutting board? What about intermediate, pro, or even guru level boards? Well, to sort this out, I've come up with 4 examples that represent each one of those levels so that you can see what tools, skills, and little tricks you need to know to master each one. Well, there is a lot to cover, so let's get started. All right, for the beginner level board, here are the tools that I'm going to need: a job site table saw, some clamps, a scraper, and a random orbit sander. The rest is just wood, glue, and a dream. And for wood, I've got these offcuts from full-length boards that I used on previous projects. These are all hardwoods and they're all S4S, which just means they're already flat and square on all 4 sides. Buying your lumber pre-milled this way does cost a little more money, but you don't have to have an expensive planer or joiner in order to do your project, so it's great for beginners with limited tools. To get started, I'm going to cut some strips of different widths out of these boards. And you can do this on a job site table saw, no problem. I recently did a video where I tested the features of this little DeWalt saw and found that while using the appropriate blade, this saw performs nearly as fast and clean as a full-size cabinet saw on this 3/4 inch wood. I'm using something here called a thin rip jig, and that's just to help me get consistently sized strips quickly and easily, which is a nice convenience that'll set you back about $25, but it's definitely not required. Instead, you can save your money and still get pretty close. Just cut a strip and place that strip on the outside face of the saw blade. Now just adjust your fence until your board is just flush with the outside edge of that strip and make your cut. It's a pretty sweet trick, right? I mean, it is a little bit slower and not quite as precise, but for 1 or 2 boards, that's fine. Personally, I'd only use the jig if I'm making a large batch of cutting boards where that efficiency can really be multiplied out over time. And I'd recommend limiting the number of strips you cut in your first project anyways. It's just going to make the glue ups that much messier and harder to align correctly. Look, do not go overboard here. You're not impressing anyone. I mean, least of all your grandma, who I'm guessing is going to be the first victim of your newfound hobby. I mean, you already know she didn't think that much of you ever since that time you spilled Kool-Aid on her Davenport. So the bar is really low here. We just want to get through this first project and hop right over that bar. So with the strips cut, I'm going to go and put this together in a pattern that looks good to my eye. I like varying the wood species and the width of the strips just to give me some nice contrast and make those colors pop when I apply the finish at the end. And don't worry if your pieces are a little different in lengths. We can go ahead and take care of that later. All right, I think that looks pretty good to me. Now to glue this up, I'm going to use some wood glue and a couple of clamps. And the glues that I like to use most often are Titebond 2 and 3. This one is water resistant and this one is waterproof, although both are rated for use in cutting boards. This one does have a little longer open time and is a little more expensive, but I think as a new woodworker, you can benefit from the longer open time just to help you get all the glue joints right. And I think pipe clamps are a great option for this project. They're cheap and you don't have very much surface area here, so you don't need big old expensive parallel clamps to get this job done. Just make sure the pipe clamp doesn't have any dried glue on it. If it does, just go ahead and scrape that off because you want a nice flat surface to reference off of. Once I have everything glued up, I'm going to clamp it just until I see a consistent amount of glue squeeze out along each joint. The biggest thing here is I want to make sure that this thing is as flat as possible. Since I'm not using a planer for the beginner level, I've got to make sure this thing stays flat. So I'm just checking underneath on both sides to make sure that I'm making solid contact with the pipe and nothing is bowing up. And now that I'm thinking about it, I should probably go ahead and wipe away this squeeze out now. Normally, this is not something you would do. You could just leave this and scrape it off or use the planer later, but I'm not using a planer for this project, so I really need to double check that these joints are as flat and seamless as possible, and I need to do it before the glue sets up so that I can make any adjustments if I need to. And sometimes you're going to find that you may need to force it flat using clamping cauls. This is just made out of a scrap of wood with a little straight edge on it, and I wrap that in packing tape so that I don't accidentally glue my caul to the cutting board. And I'm going to put the clamping caul across the glue joints on both sides, clamp it down, and then let it sit to dry, and I usually just let that happen overnight. And after a few hours, these are good to go, and now I can check my work. So I do have a couple spots here where the glue pulled up underneath the clamps, and I just need to get that off, so I'm going to use a scraper to do that and get a nice smooth surface. And I cannot pass up the opportunity to pop off all these little drips of glue from my workbench, which I think is actually the second most satisfying part of this whole build. Can you guess what I think the most satisfying thing is? Go ahead and drop your guesses down in the comments, and at the end of the video, I'll reveal my answer. And so now I can set this on the flattest surface that I have, which for me just happens to be my cabinet saw. I understand you may not have that. Just use a countertop or maybe a concrete floor. Anything that you can use just to check that the board is indeed flat or pretty close to flat. Okay, good. So I'm going to go ahead and scrape off any excess glue on the other side, and then I'm going to head back over to my table saw, and this time I'm going to use my miter gauge and a crosscut blade to square up the two jagged ends of the board. I am careful here to use some scrap plywood to back up the cut so that there's no blowout on my nice new cutting board. It's not the end of the world if that does happen, because I do still need to create nice profiled edges, which usually will take care of any blowout as long as it's not too severe. But before I do that, I've got some sanding to do. So here's what I typically do for sanding. I'm going to start out with a rough grit sandpaper like this 80 grit, and that's really going to help clean up any of the excess glue on the glue joints. Then I can follow that up with a progression of 120, 180, and then finally 220 grit sandpaper. And one trick I like to use between grits is to mark up the board with a pencil, and then once I sand the pencil marks away and everything's nice and clear again, I'm good to go to move on to the next grit. And here's a real pro tip. When I finish with that 220 grit paper, I'm going to spray the board down with a little bit of water. What this does is it makes the board feel rough again, and that's called raising the grain. All those little wood fibers that I've been sanding are now broken, and when the water hits them, they stand up on end like the hair on your arm when you get cold. And when that dries, I'm going to go ahead and quickly use that 220 grit paper again just to swipe it across the surface of the board and get rid of those broken wood fibers. And now going forward, it won't feel rough when you get it wet. Okay, I'm almost ready for finish here, but first I need to break the edges because right now these are pretty sharp and they're just going to get torn up over time if you leave them the way that they are. There's basically three ways to do this depending on the tools that you have. One way is to use a trim router with a round over bit or a chamfer bit. This is definitely going to be the quickest way to do it, and it's going to give you a consistent, uniform looking edge, but it's also an additional, somewhat expensive tool that you have to do that. So an alternative is to use something like a block plane. This is not going to be as messy or loud, and it makes some nice curly shavings, but it does take a little more time and skill to get nice, consistent looking edges. And it's much easier to make chamfers with a block plane than it is roundovers. So if you're going for roundovers and you don't want to buy an additional tool, here's what I would do. I'm just going to go and grab my sander again and lightly sand those edges down using that 220 grit paper. This is going to look a little more inconsistent, maybe a little more handmade because you might sand one edge a little bit more than another, but it's going to be fine. If you just keep moving that sander around and don't hesitate over a single area, it's going to look good enough for grandma. All right, to finish this thing off, get yourself some butcher block oil or, better yet, butcher block conditioner. I like this because it already has that oil and wax mixed together. Just smear on a generous amount and let it sit. I personally like to let this sit overnight. The next day, what you're going to find is that it's going to have a dull sheen of mainly just hardened wax because the oil soaked into the board. And now I can just wipe off any excess, give it a nice buffing, and it's good to go. And just remember, if it's not absolutely perfect, don't sweat it. Your sweet little granny's still going to love it when she sees what you made her. Now, she's still going to think you're a good for nothing, but she's going to tell you how nice and thoughtful the gift was. You just take that win and move on because you just made your first cutting board. Nice job. And for the next level board, I'm going to bump things up a bit and make a larger, thicker board with more glue joints and start adding some new features. But this does create a new problem because it's harder to locate surfaced lumber that's 1.5 or 2 inches thick. And to deal with this, you're going to have to get out of your comfort zone, away from the well-known retail stores, and search for hardwood lumber dealers. Trust me, this is like a toddler going from crawling to walking. Whole new worlds of possibility open up for you. This is where you're going to find the thicker pre-surfaced lumber, as well as exotic woods like Purple Heart, Yellow Heart, and Padauk to really add a pop of color to your cutting boards. And they'll probably have an even larger and cheaper selection of rough sawn lumber, but rough sawn means you've got to be able to mill it yourself, which means more tools. First, I'm going to need a way to cut my boards to rough length. A miter saw is the obvious choice here, and it's going to make quick work of this dense, thick lumber, but it is also the most expensive option. A cheaper way would be to go with something like a jigsaw or even a handsaw. Being able to mill your own lumber is the ultimate in woodworking freedom. You're no longer going to be stuck with the same 2 or 3 wood species, and glue-ups become much easier because you can really dial in the thickness of all your boards and mill out any bows or cups. And while it's ideal to have both a joiner and a planer, you can get away with just a planer if you make A planer sled. If your board has twist or bow, set it on the sled and look for any gaps. If there's any rocking, just shim that up until there's no movement and fasten everything with hot glue so it doesn't slide around. Just use any sheet good sized to the width of whatever planer you have and then add a cleat to the front. This will turn your planer into a joiner and allows you to completely flatten one face. Then just pop the board off the jig and run the other side through to make it match. Now that both sides are flat, I need to make a straight and square edge. Ideally, that's the job of a joiner, but you can also do this with jigs at your table saw. I did a video a while back on the most useful jigs that I've made for my shop, including this L-fence, which, by the way, is a jig that you can totally make for a job site table saw. Okay, now we're back to where we started in the beginner example with some pre-surfaced lumber, so it's time to cut some strips. So you might find 2-inch thick boards are a little harder to cut on some underpowered job site saws. But when I tested the DeWalt saw a couple videos ago, it had no issues cutting through 2-inch white oak or Purple Heart if I used a thin kerf ripping blade. So if your saw can't quite cut it, pun intended, this may be the time to think about upgrading to a contractor saw or even a cabinet saw. And keep in mind that burn marks are okay here because these are just going to get glued up and those marks are never going to be seen. So the glue up process here is exactly the same as it was in the first example. Just arrange the strips until you're happy, and how closely you pay attention to everything being dead flat here really depends on whether or not you have that planer. If you do have one, it's not as critical that everything be perfectly flat or even that the strips are all the same thickness because the planer can take care of that in just a few passes, but if you're doing it with a sander, it's going to take hours of work. Just get some glue on there and clamp the whole thing up, and don't worry about that squeeze out for now. After about an hour in the clamps, I can go ahead and scrape off that excess glue, and that's a lot cleaner process than what I did in the first example. So if it's reasonably flat, I can just go ahead and send it right through the planer until one side is completely planed flat, then flip it over and get the other side to match. And if it turns out to be not flat and there's still some rocking in there, I can go ahead and use that planer sled again the same way that I did before. Then I can square up those jagged ends and we are done. So I could just sand these up and clean up the edges, but to make them truly next level, I've got to add some features beyond just the basic cutting board. So one thing that I love to do with these thick boards is adding an under bevel, something in the 45 to 50 degree range. All right, to make a good under bevel, there is a key to success, like a really key, a double key. And it's not the angle of the blade. That can be anything that you like that looks good to you. What's really important is that the board be very square. Because if it's not square, all the lines from the facets that you cut aren't going to meet up perfectly in the corners of the boards, and it's just not going to look as good as it could. And the only way I know to get those nice square edges is to use a good crosscut sled, but I don't have one of those made for my job site saw yet, so I'm going to have to head over to my cabinet saw to make those cuts. I set the bevel angle on my table saw and I cut that out on all four sides of the board, but I do them in pairs. I cut one long side, then rotate it and get the other side. That way I don't have to move the fence and the bevel lands in the same spot. Now I can scoot the fence out of the way and look for where the blade gets really close to the top edge of the bevel. I like to make a test cut first just to see how close I got and then tap the fence just until I'm right on point. Then rotate and get the last side. Pretty easy. And this is what it looks like when the board is square and all three of those lines meet up right at the corner. And it really makes for a unique look, and this chunky board appears a lot thinner now. And it also serves a functional purpose because it's like having finger grips anywhere that you grab. Adding features to your cutting boards is one of the best ways to add value and differentiate your work from others. And the Bamboo Labs H2D is here to help me big time because it's more than just a 3D printer, it's a personal manufacturing hub. With its large 350 by 320 by 325 millimeter print volume, I can batch print more parts faster, which is great for doing large runs of parts like these custom cutting board feet. I can now make 70% more of these feet at one time than on any other printer that I have, which is a huge increase in productivity and time savings. And because the H2D has dual nozzle multi-material printing, I can combine materials with different properties. That means I can use hard PETG filament to form the base of the feet, but then add a layer of TPU at the end to give the feet a cushioned and grippy surface that's not going to slide around on a countertop. Being able to design and print multi-material projects keeps me from having to do two separate runs of parts and then assembling them together together at the end. Get that mess out of here. No more. But creating multi-material prints isn't the only way that the H2D can help me, because it also has a laser function. I quickly found a design that I wanted to print on this board to test it out. It's super easy to visualize your design right on the surface of the cutting board and then get to work adding your design. This allows me to add a layer of customization to my products that I didn't have before. And I won't be filling my shop up with any dirty smoke thanks to this smoke purifier that pulls that right out of the H2D. And look at how awesome this is. It was so fast and accurate, and the quality is amazing. This really is the best all-in-one DIY powerhouse to have in my shop. Well, I think these are ready for sanding and finishing, which is the exact same process as the previous example, so I'm ready to move on to the Pro board. Well, so far I've made a couple nice, quick, and easy boards, but now I want to take it up another notch and go to what some consider the end-all be-all, and that is an end-grain butcher block. Now, this is going to require more steps, more material, and a couple new tools, but hey, who doesn't like an excuse to get new tools? I'm going to make this board out of 100% walnut, mainly because, well, that's what I have on hand, and I also love the look of walnut end grain. This is going to take a lot more material because I'm making a bigger board, but also I'm going to be doing a lot more cutting and removing material. So for my sanity and yours, I'm skipping past re-explaining all the milling and cutting process that gets us to the first glue up, because that's all the same as before. Now, I could spend the next 3 minutes absolutely obliterating the viewer retention on this video by explaining the complicated math behind getting the exact dimensions that each one of these strips needs to be so that you end up with the right size cutting board in the end. But luckily, it's 2025. I don't have to do that. I can just tell you to go to cuttingboarddesigner.com and let them figure it out for you. This is a free online tool that lets you plan out end-grain cutting boards strip by strip and see in real time how big your end-grain board will end up being, and it gives you step-by-step instructions and dimensions for all your cuts. You can even plan your measurements out in metric, I guess if you like punishment. All right, so now I need to glue all these strips together, so I'll see you after they come out of the clamps. And with the magic of editing, it's time to clean up this panel. It's not important that this be dead flat, because I'm going to be cutting this up into strips, so there's no point. But what is critical is that it is a consistent thickness, because these faces are going to become the glue joints in the next glue up. So because of that, the planer is really the go-to tool here, and there's not many ways to get around that now. First, I'm going to square up one end so that I have a nice edge to reference against the fence. And how wide I cut these strips is determined by how thick I want the final board to be. In my case, I'm going to be making a 2-inch thick board, so I'm cutting these strips 2 1/8 inch thick. The extra 1/8 of an inch is to give me a little room to mill the board flat at the very end of the process. And once again, the crosscut sled is a great tool for making these cuts. So now that I'm down to only having a couple strips left to cut, it's safer to actually use the table saw fence, so I'm ditching the crosscut sled to finish this off. And I usually have a small bit left over here. I always make my panels a little longer than needed just to be sure that I don't end up with a strip at the end that's a little thinner than the rest, because if I do that, I'm going to end up having to mill the final board down to that thickness. And now comes the magic. I'm going to flip all these strips on end like this, and now you can really start to see that end grain board forming. So I always like to go through a process of flipping these strips around or end for end, just to see different grain orientations to see if a pattern starts to emerge that I like. Sometimes just a random jumble looks best, but sometimes you get lucky and a cool pattern will form. Just keep doing this until you're happy with the way the board looks, and then it's time for yet another glue up. So you really want to pay attention to all aspects of this glue up, because any mistakes are going to end up being in the final product. Just make sure that it's as flat as possible, and also all the glue joints need to line up with one another like a grid. You also want to make sure all these glue joints are as tight as possible and that any patterns that you created look good. I would say the number one key to this glue up is just patience. Take your time. This is one of the advantages of using that Titebond 3 and its longer open time. Because the better you do now, the easier the whole rest of this project is going to be. I'm still looking for good, even squeeze out here, and I'm going to use as many clamps as will fit to eliminate any gaps in the middle of the board. After about an hour or so, I can go ahead and scrape away any of the glue that's set up and let it sit to dry. Okay, well, the end is definitely in sight here, but there is one more key step because I have got to get this flat. So when it comes to flattening an end grain cutting board, the internet, as usual, is divided. So there's a lot of ways you can do this, including using a router sled or a CNC with a flattening bit, but the two most common ways are to use a planer or a drum sander. This video is not about whether the drum sander or planer is better. There are actually other videos out there that make good arguments for both. My best advice is if you have a floor standing planer like this one with 3 or more horsepower and with a helical cutter head and you're only making 1 or 2 ingrain boards, then you can get them flat with your planer using the proper precautions and techniques. But if you really get into making a lot of ingrain boards or all you have is a benchtop planer, then I think you should consider getting a drum sander because this tool is really great at this job. Buying a drum sander is a significant investment, but buying a new drum sander is going to be much cheaper than upgrading from that 13-inch lunchbox planer to a 15-inch floor standing planer with a helical cutter head. So if the lunchbox planer is working well for you in all other circumstances, then maybe this is the way to go. Drum sanders are much better at handling ingrain and highly figured woods or sanding things like frame and panel doors where the wood grain is at a right angle. You eliminate the risk of tear out on your workpiece or your workpiece exploding in the machine. The downside, apart from the cost, is that they are exceptionally slow. This video has been sped up a lot, but in real time, this took me about 20 minutes to remove 1/16 of an inch of material from this cutting board. And that's a job my planer could have done in 2 passes in 30 seconds time. So as Michael Scott would say,
the choice is yours.
No, choice is actually yours. Are you sure you want to do this?
Yes.
Another downside is that the cheaper drum sanders don't oscillate, and so they leave deep scratch marks across the workpiece that need to be sanded out using an aggressive sander and a low grit paper. It's not the end of the world, but it is more time that you have to spend getting this board finished. I also cleaned up the rough edges to make them square and flat, and this is another time where a crosscut sled is the perfect jig to use. And then I can just sand up through the normal grits of sandpaper just like before and clean up the edges. So on a board this size, I always like to add some features. At a minimum, I like to add some finger grips because this is a pretty large and heavy board. And the best way to get this done, I think, is using a router with a round nose bit. You could try to freehand this with a router, but I much prefer creating a setup like this one using my router table. The key to success here is creating a setup that allows you to confidently make this cut without hesitation, because hesitating over the top of a spinning bit is the thing that causes the burn marks that you'd eventually have to spend time sanding out later. We don't want to do that. We want to feel safe and confident in making this cut without stopping, a smooth motion. So I'm going to drop my board onto the bit right at my stop mark, run it to this positive stop, and immediately lift it off the bit. Being able to set fixed distances and having a large supporting fence really reduce the chance of error. In my opinion, the last thing you want to do is put all this work into this beautiful board only to destroy it at the end. And on a board this size is when you should start considering adding a juice groove. And you could certainly do this by hand with a router and a template, but I switched a long time ago to using my CNC for this process. Not only is it faster and safer, but if you do this process by hand, it's really easy to get burn marks, especially in the corners where you slow down or hesitate with the router. And I absolutely hate sanding out burn marks. It's such a huge waste of time, especially if this is your side hustle. Time is money and you don't want to add any additional labor hours to your workflow. And besides that, the CNC can also be used for engraving, which is another great way to customize your work and add value for your customers. Okay, I sanded this board now to 220 grit, just like I did before, but unlike before, I'm going to finish this using a slightly different process. Instead of going straight for the butcher block conditioner, I'm actually going to apply a coat of oil first and really let that soak into the ingrain. This kind of board can really take a lot more oil, which just helps them resist moisture that much longer, which is a good thing. And once the board accepts all the oil that it wants, then I'm going to go over the top with my own version of a paste wax. This is basically the same ingredients, just oil and wax, but I made it myself for a whole lot cheaper than the store-bought stuff. So you want me to show you how to make this? Okay. To make this finish, you'll need 2 simple ingredients. The first is beeswax, and the second ingredient is mineral oil. For this recipe, you're going to combine 4 16-ounce bottles of mineral oil with 1 pound of the beeswax for a 4-to-1 ratio. Now you need some way to melt this together, and for that, I use my favorite shop tool, my mom's old crock pot. This is the safest way I know to do it in the shop because there are no open flames. I just set the crock pot to its highest temperature. Don't ask me what that temperature is, it just says high. Then I can pour all 4 bottles of the mineral oil into the crock pot and let that heat up for about 30 minutes. Now, just dump in the bag of wax pellets and make sure to watch the pellets sink slowly into the oil because this is about the most satisfying part of the whole process. Well, almost. Then just cover that with the lid and wait. It should take about 30 to 45 minutes with the lid on to completely melt the wax. And while I'm waiting on that, I can go ahead and set up my containers next to the crock. I like to use a scrap piece of plywood underneath the crock and the containers. This can be a pretty messy process, and the plywood's going to keep the wax off of your work surface. I like to use these little 4-ounce tins for my containers. You can pick these up in several places online, and I'll go ahead and leave a link down in the description to a couple of the places that I've purchased them from in the past. Okay, so a turkey baster is a great tool for getting the wax into these tins, but I like to actually use this old reindeer measuring cup because, well, I wasn't allowed to use our turkey baster. So, reindeer measuring cup it is. What are you gonna do? Okay, by this time, you're probably noticing a wonderful scent begin to fill the shop. Go ahead and smell it. You know you want to. Aw, sorry, you can't. This next part isn't rocket science. Just get the wax into the tins as carefully as you can. Don't worry about making a mess. This is why you put the plywood down. This recipe makes about 20 of these 4-ounce tins with a little bit to spare. After the first pour, I just go back and top everything off using the remaining wax. I just eyeball the top of the tin to make sure that they're all full. And when you're done, please make sure to turn off the crock pot. You don't want to recreate any famous TV scenes in your shop. Now, just sit back and watch while the wax cools in the tins. And the last step is just to lid up your tins and clean off any of the wax that may have spilled. And that's it. Easy peasy. One of the annoying parts of the finishing process is that I never seem to have a great place to put my boards while the oil is soaking into the wood. But I was able to hop on over to Maker World and find this simple cutting board rack that's going to work perfectly to hold my boards up and off the workbench. And thanks to the H2D's active chamber heating, I can print this rack out of rugged glass fiber ABS, which is going to help it stand up to the beating that it's going to take laying around my shop. And this also gave me the idea to find a really simple and minimalistic display stand for my finished boards. These would be great to take to craft shows and holiday events, as well as display your boards on your kitchen countertop. And once that board has sat overnight, it's time to wipe off any of the excess wax and buff it to a nice dull sheen and a buttery smooth feel. And another thing that I think makes sense on a board like this is to add feet. And check out these brass feet. Who knew? Besides being super classy paired with this walnut, brass is durable and antimicrobial, which is great for this application. Maximizing the efficiency of your workflows is all about finding little improvements that all add up over time. For instance, installing these feet. I was able to find this simple little jig over on Maker World, and in a couple of clicks, send it over to the H2D, print it out, and now I can locate all my pilot holes on all 4 corners without having to measure in and mark from each side and then add a pilot point. Now, this one thing may save me just 1 or 2 minutes per board, but stack that up over all the boards that I ever make, and this is going to make a real difference. I can feel the efficiencies adding up. So now you can see exactly how much planning, material, and work goes into one of these boards, which is why they generally cost more money. But this next level board is going to make this one look like a walk in the park. Well, this is one of the most difficult boards I have ever made. I mean, it's got everything. Tropical end grains, multiple painstaking glue-ups, and delicate hardwood inlays. And hey, if you don't like this design, the concepts still apply to any inlaid end grain board. So to get started, I'm going to need 3 separate species of lumber. For the white stripes, I'm going to use hard maple. For the red stripes, I'm going to use Paduke. You could also use bloodwood. And for the union where the stars go, I'm going to use purple heart. So to begin, I need to cut all this lumber to rough length. I'm cutting these pieces to 12.5 inches, which is all I need for one board. And now my saw looks like it's been eating flaming hot Cheetos. I'm going to cut the maple board slightly smaller at 11 inches since there's one less white stripe than red. And the purple heart gets cut to 9-inch pieces. One of the reasons I love this project so much is because I get to work with these amazing colored tropical hardwoods, which isn't something I get to do in my projects very often. And the fact that they're extremely dense and hard makes them perfect for this application. Next, I head over to the table saw because I want to cut all this maple down so that it matches the width of the Paduke. This way there'll be consistency to the grain pattern across the cutting board. And then I need to joint the edges of all these boards. That's going to help me eliminate any gaps in my glue-ups that would show through in the final board. The final step is to rip these at the table saw so the opposite edge is parallel to the jointed edge. That's it for milling. Now it's time for glue-up number 1. I sure hope you like glue-ups because this project has a lot of them. I'm lining these boards up side by side to make 24-inch panels that are only a few inches long. This is going to introduce a unique obstacle that I'm going to have to solve for once these dry. And here's a quick tip for dealing with tropical woods. Most of these species contain oils that can rise to the surface if they've been sitting a while. It's best to remove that oil from the surface with alcohol or acetone before you glue up your board, since the oil may not play nicely with the water-based wood glues. So it's been a few hours and my panels are now out of the clamps and dry, and it's time to mill them to a consistent thickness of 7/8 of an inch. Now for the Purple Heart panel, I'm going to take care of that on the planer, but for these other two panels, I've got a problem. The grain is running perpendicular to the cutter head, so I can't send these through the planer because it could potentially damage the panel and damage the planer, so I'm going to have to rely on my drum sander to get these down to the right thickness. The drum sander is one of those tools that you don't have to use very often, but it's absolutely key in a project like this where a planer is far from ideal and a hand sander can't guarantee you a consistent thickness. And now I'm going to take all that hard work and cut it to ribbons. Well, stripes actually. I'm cutting each panel into 1 5/8 inch strips. My final board thickness is set to 1.5 inches, so this is going to give me 1/8 of an inch of wiggle room, which I'll use later. Now I just need to arrange all my strips into stripes. I'm placing the end grain facing up and alternating red and white stripes. I'm also getting a glimpse at how awesome this board is going to look in the end. And now I'm dividing the stripes into an upper and lower section, and then also staggering the strips so that the glue joints on the boards don't line up perfectly. This will create a more interesting look. And now we've arrived at glue up number 2, and this one's a doozy. 13 strips to glue up. Well, almost. I need to leave the joint between the third white stripe from the bottom and the red stripe just above it with no glue. This will give me the upper and lower stripe sections to assemble later. I need to be sure to glue these as flat and straight as possible. Ingrain strips can bend pretty easily under the force of clamps, and so you can end up gluing an arc into the board. I do the same thing for the Purple Heart to create the union for the flag, and these just need to sit now for a few hours to cure. Alright, so it's the next day and the second glue up is out of the clamps, and I now have 3 separate parts that are going to make up this board. I went ahead and cleaned up any of the excess glue squeeze out that was still remaining on here, and I just used a scraper for that. And now it's time to send these parts back through the drum sander to get them all to a consistent thickness again. After that, we're going to trim everything up and get it ready for assembly. Alright, so now that all our parts are in grain, the drum sander is a must-have tool once again. I need to get all 3 of these parts to the exact same thickness. This is why I made the strips an extra 1/8 of an inch wide to give me room to do this step. Once everything is sanded to the same thickness, I can cut off the ragged edges with my track saw. I'm not cutting them the final length just yet because there's more assembly to come. Now I have 2 sections of this board that fit together perfectly, and man, don't they look so awesome already? But you may have noticed something is missing. I've got to make room for the union, which means that I need to cut this short so that I can glue these 2 pieces together, and then once those are together, I can come back and add the 3rd piece to make the complete cutting board. So before I do the final assembly, I'm going to go ahead and do the star inlay on the union. It's better to do this step now before it becomes part of the cutting board, because if I did it later on in the process and I wasn't happy with the inlay, I'd have to cut the union carefully out of the board, remake this, and then put it back in, and that just sounds like an absolute nightmare. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of it now, make sure I'm good with the inlay, and then do the final assembly. Once I've got my tool path sent to the CNC, it's time to cut. I like to stick my workpiece to the CNC with 2-sided tape. This is my favorite way to attach my work to the machine because it holds so well and it doesn't get in the way of the bit as it cuts. So with my 60-degree V-bit, I'm going to cut the negative space into the union. This will be where the inlay goes. This part of the process goes fairly quickly as this is a pretty simple V-carve. Now for the inlay. I made up this blank out of maple ingrain and attached it to a scrap of plywood to raise it up high enough so that the bit won't hit my fence. Cutting the inlay is a much longer process. I think this one took about 3 hours. And it starts with a straight bit hogging out the majority of the waste around the stars. Once that is done, I switch back over to the same 60-degree V-bit and I cut the stars. What I'm cutting here is the exact mirror image of the design that I carved in the union, which will allow me to then flip this over and fit it exactly into the negative space. With the inlay finally cut, I need to rip off the waste edges at the bandsaw. And next comes glue up number 3. I add a dab of glue into each of the 50 stars and then make sure to spread that glue out into all those star points. It's tedious but super important, otherwise you might have a corner of a star pop out down the road. Then I can just flip the negative over and add as many clamps as I can. The key here is getting even clamping pressure to all the stars. I'm also using a wrench here not because I'm cranking down on the clamps, but because I didn't have room to get my hand in to turn the grip of the clamp. All right, so it's been about 8 hours in the clamps, and that's absolutely as long as I can wait. So to remove the waste, I could throw this back on the CNC and use an end mill to remove all of this waste and get down to the inlay. But really, it's quicker and faster to just use a bandsaw to do it. I just line the blade up with that gap and begin the cut. I'm taking it slow so that the blade doesn't wander back into my workpiece. And with my square standing in as a push stick, the big reveal. And with new paper in the drum sander, this inlay finished up perfectly. With the inlay complete and looking great, I'm going to cut the top stripe section to make room for the union. Now I can do glue up number 4 and attach the union to the top section of stripes. I'm gluing it with the inlay facing down so I can ensure that the face of the board is flush. Once that comes out of the clamps, I can do the 5th and final glue up of this board and add the bottom stripes. I'm paying extra attention to these last 2 glue ups to make sure that everything is seamless and even. At this point, I don't have a lot of room left to sand, and so I don't want to take too many passes through the drum sander. This last sanding is where the drum sander is most important. With these super small inlays, I need to be able to remove tiny bits of material at a time, and even if you were brave enough to put an end-grain board through your planer, you definitely wouldn't want to do it with these delicate inlays in there. Now I just give the board a good sanding with 80 grit paper first to remove any of the scratches made by the drum sander, and then go all the way up to 220 grit. Then I just knocked off the corners of the board using a disc sander and this handy little right angle jig that I made. I also make sure to clean up the edges with a block plane. Using a block plane here is a much better option than a router because running a router bit across all this end grain has a really high chance of tear out and ruining this amazing board right at the very end of the project. Now comes the big payoff, the part that makes all this work and attention to detail worth it. Look at that color. I'll keep applying this mineral oil until the board doesn't soak any more in. And after the paste wax sits on the board for a couple of hours, I buff it out with a clean cotton t-shirt until it has a soft glowing sheen. Well, that's pretty much everything I know about making cutting boards. So where do you land and what level would you like to try? Let me know down in the comments below. Are you a beginner, intermediate, pro, or guru? And as always, thanks for watching. And remember, have fun in the shop.